I wonder what comes to your mind when I say the word wholehearted. Do missionaries come to mind? Missionaries like Jim and Elizabeth Elliot? Do martyrs come to mind? Maybe the ones of whom the writers of Hebrews tells us the world was not worthy? Or perhaps some childhood story which was read to you of some great hero, some pillar of our faith. You see, wholehearted is a grandiose kind of word. It carries with it connotations of the ambitious and of the inspiring. The word is primed to be applied to people who have done great things for God, people like the ones these namesake speeches are about. And surely there is value in this. Adults, like children, need heroes too, for they help us, as Dr. Hoagland has said, cultivate a proper imagination for how to live the Christian life. Elizabeth Elliot certainly does this for me. Wife to Jim Elliot, the missionary who in 1956 was speared to death in an Ecuadorian jungle. The woman who stayed in Ecuador with her 10-month-old daughter to minister to the very people who killed her husband. She did not go home or become paralyzed with hopeless despair. When everyone said, "Go back to America, mourn and raise your daughter, you've done it all and then some," she rather turned around and cannonballed, as it were, into the deep end of renewed passion for God and his gospel. But we must ask, is everything short of this kind of service half-hearted? By that I mean, is great suffering a necessary ingredient in the recipe that makes wholeheartedness? In my brief time with you all tonight, I would like to submit that Elizabeth Elliot did not see wholeheartedness as primarily a quality achieved by momentous suffering. In other words, Elliot believed wholeheartedness in commitment to Christ is most often evidenced not in the, might I say, glorious moments of sacrifice, but rather in the quiet, unnoticed suffering of daily dying to self. I recently read Elizabeth Elliot's book, A Path Through Suffering. The content of the book surprised me. I imagined that a woman who had undergone such immense, such unique suffering would use the opportunity of a book on suffering to speak of those experiences. She did not. In fact, the loss of her husband Jim on the mission field is barely mentioned. The years serving and forgiving those in Ecuador are hardly even alluded to. No, the primary arena of suffering that Elliot speaks to is the everyday life. Her book is an unfolding of this sentence: the whole Christian life is a process of bringing the self-life down to death in order that the life of Jesus may be manifest in us. Okay? But what does bringing the self-life down to death mean? Elliot answers this from two perspectives. First, from the active perspective of the choices we make, and second, from the passive perspective of God's purpose carried out in us. At Bethlehem, we, I believe rightly, deny the doctrine that is sometimes referred to as decisional regeneration. I make a decision for Jesus to come into my life, and there, I'm saved. Yet in our denial of this doctrine, have we forgotten the biblical reality of what we might call regenerational decisions? In regeneration, God grants the ability, by the power that raised Jesus from the dead, to choose every day at seemingly countless moments between what Paul sets forward in Galatians 5 to either walk in step with the Spirit or to gratify the desires of the flesh. Elliot puts it this way, quote, "My decision to receive Christ, although made only once, I must affirm in thousands of ways, through thousands of choices, for the rest of my life. My will or his. It is no to myself, and yes to him." End quote. The decision language from Elliot need not unnerve us. No more than the former part of Paul's compound sentence, "I worked harder than any of them," unnerves us. Elliot reminds us that we, as creatures who inhabit time and space, live in a perpetual state of this experience. It is indeed a choice to wash the dishes, to interpret that harsh remark graciously and not to take offense by it, or to withhold from saying that self-promoting comment. She continues to describe what this choice of daily death looks like. Quote, "This continual affirmation of her decision to receive Christ is usually made in small things, inconveniences, unselfish giving up of preferences, yielding gracefully to the wishes of others without playing the martyr, learning to close doors quietly and to turn the volume down on the music we love to play loudly. Sufferings they may be, but only small-sized ones. We may think of them as little deaths," end quote. These examples come almost as a surprise in their granular practicality. Turning down my favorite Spotify playlist and forgoing the last of the cream? Yes, every day, Elliot tells us, we are given thousands of split-second options to either walk in God's ways or our own. A choice. But this death to self cannot merely be a series of choices, or rather, a choice is not the whole way of speaking of death to the old self. If it were, it would be indistinguishable from the moral bootstrap pulling of every other religion. We need the latter part of Paul's sentence, "Yet it was not I, but the grace of Christ that is with me." Does this latter part of Paul's sentence annul the first? If he intended it to, he would only have said, "It was the grace of Christ that is with me that made me work harder than any of them." Both clauses are essential for a proper understanding of the Christian life. We need both perspectives. Elliot understood this when she spoke of the death and rebudding of a leaf as a parable for the Christian's sanctification. She writes this, quote, "Botanists say that across the leaf stalk there forms in autumn a layer of thin-walled cells, termed the layer of separation. From the first hour that the layer of separation begins to form in the leaf stalk, the leaf's fate is sealed. There is never a moment's reversal of the decision. Each day that follows is a steady carrying out of the plant's purpose. This old leaf shall die, and the new leaf shall live," end quote. Isn't this an excellent illustration? God stores up in leaves all that they need to instinctively do this, and they do. Likewise, God does the same thing for Christians in sanctification. Dying to self is, in this way, an altogether natural and seemingly involuntary process for the Christian. So, putting these things together, I think that if Elizabeth Elliot were asked, what makes a person wholehearted, she would say, it is when a person demonstrates that they belong wholly to God by daily choosing His ways over their own. Thus, it is not only those pillars of the faith that have endured some great tragedy or have made some mark on Christian history who can claim wholeheartedness. It is them. But it is also anyone who has wholly died to sin and been wholly raised to newness of life in Christ. In this way, suffering is necessary if we are to be wholehearted, but it is not the pain of a Huarani spear tip, but rather the pain of the blade of God's Spirit, severing us, as Elliot puts it, from our former life. This is good news for us, dear friends, classmates, professors. We can live in wholehearted devotion to Jesus Christ tonight and tomorrow and Monday afternoon at 2:45 when we feel half-hearted and irritable. God is building a coliseum of wholehearted saints. He is pleased to make people like Elizabeth Elliot, like those heroes you heard about at story time, and like the people sitting next to you in that pew, into wholehearted pillars.